I was Margaret, a proud, no nonsense retired schoolteacher who thought I had faith all figured out, a woman who prayed every morning and judged others by night, believing my righteousness was my ticket to heaven. But everything changed the moment my heart stopped beating, and I was pulled into a darkness so vast it swallowed my certainty whole. What I saw, hell itself, stripped away every illusion I clung to, forcing me to face my sins, my pride, and even Lucifer himself. That journey didn't just change my life, it saved my soul. I never imagined my life would end in the middle of a birthday party. There I was, surrounded by my family, my daughter, Susan, her kids, even my son in law, who I didn't much care for. The candles on the cake flickered as everyone sang, Happy Birthday, their voices blending in awkward harmony. I should have been happy, but all I could focus on was the mess in the living room Susan hadn't cleaned, the way her youngest was squirming instead of standing still, and the fact that she'd brought store-bought cake instead of making one like I used to. Small things, I told myself, but they gnawed at me like termites. The last thing I remember was reaching for the knife to cut the cake. A sharp pain gripped my chest, radiating through my left arm. I gasped, staggered, and then everything went black. I expected to wake up in a hospital room, or not at all. Instead, I found myself standing in complete silence, surrounded by darkness, so thick it felt alive. I reached out, but my hands touched nothing. The ground beneath my feet was cold and uneven, though I couldn't see it. My breathing quickened. Where am I? I whispered, though I already feared the answer. The silence was broken by a low, rumbling laugh. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. You've always thought you knew where you were going, Margaret, a voice said, smooth and deep, with an edge of mockery. But your certainty, well, it seems that's led you here. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The air seemed to press down on me, making it hard to think, let alone speak. And then, like a curtain being pulled back, the darkness shifted. I was no longer standing in an endless void, but in the middle of my childhood church, or at least some grotesque version of it. The pews were splintered, the stained glass windows shattered, and the altar was covered in ash. The air smelled of sulfur and decay. You think you know what sin looks like, the voice continued, closer now. I turned and saw him. He wasn't the red, horned demon I'd grown up hearing about. He looked human, tall, handsome in a sharp, angular way, dressed in a black suit that seemed to absorb the dim, flickering light. His eyes, though, were what terrified me. They burned, not with fire, but with something far worse, knowledge. I know who you are. I managed to choke out. My voice sounded small, even to me. You're Satan. He smiled. Lucifer, if you don't mind. Satan's more of a title, really. He stepped closer, his hands clasped behind his back like a professor about to deliver a lecture. And you, Margaret, are exactly where you belong. No, I said, shaking my head. No, this is a mistake. I'm a good person. I've been a Christian my whole life. You prayed, yes. Attended church, memorized verses, judged others while patting yourself on the back for your so-called piety, he interrupted. His tone was casual, almost bored, but his words cut deep. Tell me, Margaret, when was the last time you actually loved anyone the way your God commanded you to? I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the words wouldn't come. Memories began to flash before me, unbidden and relentless. There I was, scolding Susan for marrying a man I didn't approve of, lecturing my grandchildren about their behavior instead of listening to them, dismissing a neighbor's cry for help because I was too busy. Each moment came with a pang of guilt I couldn't push aside. This can't be hell, I whispered. I don't belong here. Lucifer chuckled, circling me like a predator, sizing up its prey. Oh, Margaret, hell isn't fire and brimstone, not for you at least. It's reflection. It's truth. And it's exactly what you've earned. I fell to my knees, trembling. The floor beneath me shifted, and I was no longer in the church. I was in my classroom, the one where I taught for 30 years. But it wasn't the bright, cheerful space I remembered. The walls were cracked and peeling, the desks broken and scattered. In the corner sat a boy I recognized immediately, Peter, one of my former students. He looked exactly as he had the day he left my classroom for the last time, small, pale, and scared. Do you remember him? Lucifer asked, his voice softer now, but no less dangerous. Or is he just one of many you've forgotten? I, I remember, I said, though my voice wavered. Peter had been a quiet, awkward boy who struggled with his studies. I'd lost patience with him more than once, especially on the day he'd come to me, trembling, asking for help after class. I'd snapped at him, told him to try harder, to stop making excuses. He'd transferred schools a week later, and I'd never given him much thought after that. He never forgot you, Lucifer said, his eyes fixed on Peter. He carried your words with him, long after you'd moved on. They became a weight he couldn't put down, a voice in his head telling him he'd never be enough. Peter's image shifted, morphing into a teenager and then a young man, each version of him looking more broken than the last. I saw him alone in his room, struggling with books he didn't understand. I saw him crying, drinking, spiraling. And then I saw him end it. No, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. No, that's not my fault. He had other problems. He, he came to you for help, Lucifer said, his voice cutting through my protests like a knife. And you turned him away. That was your choice, Margaret. You believed yourself righteous, but you were anything but. I sobbed, the weight of his words and the images crushing me. What do you want from me? I finally managed to ask. Lucifer crouched in front of me, his burning eyes locking onto mine. I want nothing, Margaret. But you want redemption. And if you're willing to face the truth of who you are, perhaps you can earn it. One soul. That's all you're allowed to save. But choose wisely. One soul. I echoed, my voice barely audible. How? He smiled again, that same sharp, cruel smile. By doing what you've never done before, looking beyond yourself. The room began to fade, the images of Peter and my classroom dissolving into shadow. I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, pulling me somewhere new, somewhere worse. Lucifer's voice echoed around me as the darkness swallowed me whole. Your journey begins now, Margaret. Let's see what kind of faith you truly have. When the darkness cleared, I found myself standing in a place that seemed alive with despair. It wasn't the empty void or the broken church I'd seen before. This was something far worse. The ground beneath me was made of cracked, charred stone, and the air hung thick with an acrid smell that stung my throat. Around me were shapes, people, I realized, wandering aimlessly, their faces twisted in pain or vacant with hopelessness. It wasn't fire or brimstone. It was something deeper, colder, like the absence of everything good and warm I'd ever known. Lucifer was nowhere to be seen, but his voice echoed in my mind like a whisper carried on the wind. Keep walking, Margaret. You'll find our answers soon enough. His tone was mocking, as though he enjoyed watching me stumble through this nightmare. I hated him for it, but a part of me hated myself more for being here, for earning this. I took a hesitant step forward, then another, unsure of where I was going or what I was supposed to do. The people around me didn't seem to notice me. They moved like shadows, murmuring words I couldn't make out, their hands clawing at the empty air as if reaching for something they could never grasp. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I felt their pain like a weight pressing on my chest. It was overwhelming, suffocating, and it made me realize something I didn't want to admit. I didn't belong in heaven. Not yet. I came to what looked like a twisted version of my old neighborhood. The houses were warped and crumbling, their windows shattered and doors hanging off their hinges. I recognized some of them. Mrs. Carter's house with the hydrangeas, the Wilkins place where their kids used to play. But they were all wrong, hollowed out like the shells of memories. And then I saw him. Peter was sitting on the curb in front of his house, or what was left of it. He looked younger than I remembered, no older than 16, though his eyes held a depth of sorrow that made him seem much older. He didn't look up as I approached, his hands busy picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. My heart clenched at the sight of him. This wasn't the confident, hopeful student I'd once dismissed. This was a boy who had been broken long before his time. Peter, I said softly, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. I tried again, stepping closer. Peter, it's me, Mrs. Hensley. At that, he looked up, his face a mix of confusion and something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or disbelief. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I know, I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. But I'm here now, and I need to talk to you. He shook his head, looking back down at his sleeve. It doesn't matter. Nothing matters here. Of course it matters, I said, kneeling in front of him. Peter, I'm so sorry for how I treated you. I was wrong, so wrong, and I didn't see it until now. I want to help you. His laugh was bitter, hollow. You can't help me. No one can. I've been here too long. The hopelessness in his voice cut through me like a knife. That's not true, I said, reaching out to touch his arm. Please, Peter, just talk to me. Let me understand. He pulled away, his eyes flashing with anger. Understand? You can't understand what it's like to be here, to feel like this. You don't belong here, Mrs. Hensley. You're just visiting. His words stung, but I couldn't blame him for them. He was right, I didn't understand. Not fully, but I wanted to. I had to. Then help me, I said, my voice shaking. Tell me what I can do to make this right. Peter stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stood, his movements slow and deliberate. You want to help me? He asked, his tone cold. Then follow me. He started walking, and I hurried to keep up. The landscape around us seemed to shift as we moved, the houses dissolving into ruins and then reforming as something else entirely, a school hallway. My school hallway. It was empty, the lockers rusted and dented, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Peter stopped in front of a door I recognized immediately, my old classroom. I don't want to go in there, I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. But Peter just looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of challenge and resignation. This is where it started, he said. For me, anyway. The door creaked open, and I followed him inside. The room was just as I remembered it, but darker somehow, colder. The desks were still arranged in neat rows, though many of them were cracked or missing pieces. At the front of the room was a blackboard with my handwriting still scrawled across it, the words blurred and illegible. Peter walked to the desk he used to sit in, running his hand along its surface. You told me I wasn't trying hard enough, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You told me to stop making excuses to grow up. Do you remember that? I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. I do, I said, my voice breaking. And I was wrong. I didn't see how much you were struggling, how much you needed someone to believe in you. It doesn't matter, he said, his tone flat. It's too late now. It's not too late, I said, stepping closer to him. Peter, please. Let me help you. Let me. You can't, he shouted, turning on me with a fury that took my breath away. You can't fix this, Mrs. Hensley. You can't fix me. I'm already broken. His words hit me like a physical blow, and I staggered back, my heart pounding. For a moment, I didn't know what to say, how to respond. But then I remembered Lucifer's words, the challenge he'd given me. I couldn't save Peter by fixing him. I could only save him by loving him, by showing him the compassion I'd failed to show before. You're not broken, Peter, I said, my voice steady now. You're hurt, and I'm so sorry for the part one played in that. I can't change the past, but I can be here now. I can listen, and I can tell you that you matter. He looked at me, his expression softening just slightly. Why now? He asked, his voice trembling. Why do you care now after everything? Because I see you now, I said. Not as a student or a responsibility, but as a person who deserves to be heard and loved. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, slowly, he sat down at the desk and rested his head in his hands. I don't know if I can believe you, he said. That's okay, I said, sitting down beside him. I'll stay as long as it takes. The room began to shift again, the walls dissolving into light. I could feel the ground moving beneath me, pulling me somewhere new. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I had started something, and I wasn't going to stop now. The light that had surrounded me after leaving Peter faded slowly, leaving me standing in an empty, featureless void. I expected relief, maybe even a sense of accomplishment for helping him, but instead, I felt a gnawing doubt. Had I truly helped Peter, or had I just begun to scratch the surface of his pain? My chest tightened with the weight of the question, and for a moment, I wondered if that doubt would consume me. Then, a new sound broke the silence, the faint, rhythmic clinking of chains. It started softly, like the distant tick of a clock, but grew louder with every passing second. The void around me shifted, forming into something more solid. A long corridor made of dark stone, its walls slick with a liquid I didn't want to think too much about. The clinking grew louder, sharper, echoing off the stone, and I realized I wasn't alone. Shadows moved in the distance, dragging chains behind them, their faces obscured but their despair palpable. I wanted to turn back, but there was no turning back in this place. Lucifer's voice returned, sharp and sudden, as though he'd been reading my thoughts. "This is where the truly heavy burdens are carried, Margaret," he said, his voice echoing off the walls. "The burdens people refuse to let go of, the chains they've forged themselves." "What am I supposed to do here?" I called out, my voice shaking as I walked further into the corridor. I hated the way the words sounded, small, desperate, and helpless. "You'll see," he replied with a chilling softness, and then the voice faded, leaving me alone once more. I followed the sound of the chains, my feet dragging as if the air itself was trying to hold me back. Finally, I came to the end of the corridor and found myself in what looked like a cavernous, crumbling ballroom. The walls were lined with mirrors, each cracked and fogged, their surfaces flickering like static-filled television screens. In the center of the room stood a figure with his back to me, his hands bound in thick, rusted chains that coiled around him like a serpent. I knew who it was before he even turned. "Robert," I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. My husband turned slowly, his face drawn and tired, his eyes filled with a pain that made my heart ache. He looked older than when I'd last seen him in life, though I couldn't tell if it was the years or the weight of the chains dragging him down. "Margaret," he said, his voice hoarse and filled with a mixture of shame and relief. "You're here." I wanted to run to him, to throw my arms around him and hold him, but something stopped me. The weight of everything unspoken between us, everything I'd buried, hung in the air like a storm cloud. "Why are you here?" I asked instead, the words harsher than I intended. He looked down, unable to meet my eyes. "I failed you," he said. "I failed our marriage. I failed God." The memories rushed back before I could stop them. The late nights when he'd stayed out without explanation, the hushed phone calls, the distance that had grown between us in the final years of our marriage. I'd suspected, of course, but I'd never confronted him. Instead, I'd buried my anger and let it fester, pretending that silence was the same as forgiveness. "You cheated on me," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. It wasn't a question. "Didn't you?" He flinched as though I'd struck him, and I hated the part of me that felt satisfaction at his reaction. "Yes," he said, his voice barely audible. "It was one mistake, a moment of weakness, but it's haunted me ever since. I tried to repent, but the guilt never left. And now," he gestured to the chains wrapped around him, the rusted links clinking as he moved. "Now, I carry this." My anger flared, hot and immediate, but it was accompanied by something else, something I didn't want to acknowledge. A small voice in the back of my mind whispered that I'd failed him too. I'd been so focused on his betrayal, on my own hurt, that I'd never stopped to consider what might have driven him to that point. I'd held onto my resentment like a shield, using it to justify my coldness, my distance, my refusal to forgive. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "You broke my trust, Robert. You broke us." I know, he said, his voice breaking. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve anything. That's why I'm here. The room seemed to darken, the mirrors along the walls flickering more violently. I turned to look at them and saw scenes playing out in each one. Moments from our marriage, frozen and distorted. There was the day we bought our first house, the joy on our faces as we held the keys. There was the fight we had after he forgot our anniversary, the sharp words I'd thrown at him like daggers. And there, in the largest mirror, was the moment I'd found the receipt for the hotel room he'd rented, my face a mask of quiet rage. This place isn't about punishment, a voice said behind me, and I turned to see Lucifer standing in the shadows, his expression unreadable. It's about reflection. You've both been carrying this weight for far too long. But the chains, Margaret, they're not just his. They're yours too. I wanted to deny it, to argue, but the truth was there in the mirrors, staring back at me. I'd held on to my anger, my pain, my sense of betrayal, and I'd let it poison me. It was a weight I'd carried for so long that I hadn't even realized it was there. I looked back at Robert, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his chains, and I realized that if I couldn't forgive him, I would never be free either. Taking a deep breath, I stepped closer to him. Robert, I said, my voice trembling. I'm angry. I'm hurt. But I don't want to carry this anymore. I don't want to hate you anymore. His eyes widened, and for the first time since I'd arrived, there was a glimmer of hope in them. Margaret, I forgive you, I said, and as the words left my lips, something shifted. The chains around him began to dissolve, crumbling into dust and falling away. The mirrors around us shattered, the images inside them disappearing into nothingness. The weight in my own chest lifted, replaced by a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Robert looked at me, tears streaming down his face. Thank you, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I don't deserve it, but thank you. Before I could respond, the light began to grow again, brighter and brighter, until it engulfed us both. I reached out to him, but he was already fading, his form dissolving into the light. Goodbye, Margaret, he said softly, and then he was gone. I stood alone in the empty ballroom, my heart heavy but lighter than it had been in years. The light faded, and the ground beneath me began to shift once more, pulling me toward the next step of my journey. I didn't know what awaited me, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it. The ground beneath me shifted again, the remnants of the ballroom dissolving into nothingness as I was pulled into another part of this strange, tormenting landscape. I braced myself, unsure of what would come next. The weight I'd felt after confronting Robert had lifted, but the ache of it still lingered, as though my soul had been stretched too thin. I didn't know how much more of this I could take, yet something inside me refused to stop. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was desperation, but I kept moving forward, even as the world around me solidified into something new. I found myself in a forest, though it was unlike any forest I'd ever seen. The trees were tall and gnarled, their bark blackened and cracked like charcoal. Their branches twisted toward the sky, clawing at it like desperate hands. The air was thick with a sickly green fog that clung to my skin and filled my lungs with each breath. I could hear whispers all around me, soft and indistinct, as if the trees themselves were speaking. It was disorienting, and I turned in a slow circle, trying to find some sense of direction. Lost are we? Lucifer's voice cut through the fog like a blade, sharp and amused. I turned to see him leaning casually against one of the twisted trees, his suit immaculate despite the grime and decay around him. His expression was as unreadable as ever, but there was a glint in his eyes that made me uneasy. I'm not lost, I said, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. He tilted his head, his smile widening just enough to make my skin crawl. Oh, but you are, Margaret. You've always been lost, haven't you? Wandering through life with your head held high, pretending you knew exactly where you were going. But here, there's no pretending. I glared at him, the anger bubbling up before I could stop it. If you're just here to mock me, then go away. I don't need you. He laughed, a sound that echoed through the forest like a chorus of mocking voices. Oh, but you do need me. You just don't want to admit it. After all, who else is going to show you the truth? Before I could respond, he straightened and gestured to the fog. Go on, then. Keep walking. See where it takes you. I didn't trust him, but I didn't have much of a choice. I turned away from him and started walking, the whispers growing louder with each step. They were still indistinct, but I could feel their weight, like hands brushing against me, tugging at my soul. The fog grew thicker, and soon I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. My steps slowed as the ground beneath me grew uneven, roots and stones threatening to trip me with every step. And then I heard it, a voice, clearer than the whispers, though still faint. It sounded like someone crying out in pain. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice came again, louder this time, and I realized it wasn't just pain, it was anger, despair, the kind of raw emotion that cuts to the bone. Hello, I called out, my voice shaky. Is someone there? The voice didn't respond, but the sound grew louder, pulling me forward like a magnet. I pushed through the fog, the trees seeming to close in around me, their branches reaching for me like claws. Finally, I stumbled into a small clearing, and there in the center was the source of the voice. It was me. I stared at the figure in the clearing, my breath catching in my throat. She was sitting on the ground, her arms wrapped around her knees, her head bowed. She looked exactly like me, down to the last detail, but there was something off about her, something broken. Her hair was matted, her clothes torn and stained, and when she looked up at me, her eyes were hollow, filled with a pain so deep it made my chest ache. Who are you? I whispered, though I already knew the answer. She didn't respond at first, just stared at me with those empty eyes. Then, slowly, she stood, her movements jerky and unnatural. You don't recognize me? She asked, her voice sharp and accusing. I'm you, Margaret. I'm the part of you that you've spent your entire life ignoring. I shook my head, backing away from her. No, that's not possible. You're not me. She laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. Of course I'm you. I'm the part of you that you buried under all your pride and self-righteousness. The part of you that you were too afraid to face. I wanted to argue, to deny it, but her words struck a chord deep inside me. Why are you here? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She stepped closer, her hollow eyes boring into mine. I'm here because you can't move forward until you face me, until you face yourself. All your life, you've judged others, looked down on them, blamed them for their failures. But you've never looked at your own. You've never admitted your own sins. The words cut through me like a knife, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I've tried, I said, my voice trembling. I've tried to be better. She shook her head, her expression filled with pity. You've tried to hide, to pretend. But you can't hide here, Margaret. Not anymore. The weight of her words settled on my chest, and I sank to my knees, the tears spilling over. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice breaking. How am I supposed to fix this? She knelt in front of me, her expression softening just slightly. You can't fix it, she said. That's not the point. The point is to face it, to accept it. You have to forgive yourself, Margaret. Otherwise, you'll never be free. The words hit me like a blow, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Forgive myself? I'd spent my entire life believing that forgiveness was something you earned, something that came from repentance and penance. But here, in this place, I realized that wasn't enough. Forgiveness wasn't about earning. It was about letting go. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I looked her in the eyes. I'm sorry, I said, my voice shaking. I'm sorry for everything. For the way I've treated others, for the way I've treated myself. I forgive you. I forgive me. As the words left my lips, the figure in front of me began to dissolve, her hollow eyes softening into something almost like peace. The fog around us began to lift, and the forest faded into light. I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of release I hadn't realized I needed. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt whole. And then the ground shifted again, pulling me toward the next step of my journey. When the ground stopped shifting beneath me, I found myself standing in a place that felt eerily familiar, but utterly wrong. It was a room, clean and bright, with white walls and floors so polished they reflected the faint light overhead. At first, it looked like a waiting room in a doctor's office, bland and sterile. But as I turned in a slow circle, the walls seemed to stretch and distort, the reflections warping until it felt like the room was watching me. In the center of the room stood a single chair. It was plain and wooden, its surface smooth as though it had been worn down by countless hands over the years. Despite its simplicity, it exuded a weight, a presence, as though it had seen more than its fair share of stories. My stomach churned, and I hesitated, unsure of whether to approach it. "You've come far, Margaret." Lucifer's voice, as always, arrived without warning. I turned to find him standing in the corner, leaning against the wall as if he'd been there the entire time. He looked different now. Gone was the tailored suit and polished demeanor. His shirt was rumpled, his tie loosened, and there was something almost weary in his expression. "What now?" I asked, my voice barely steady. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally, and the sight of him only reminded me that my journey was far from over. "Now," he said, pushing off the wall and stepping closer, "comes the hardest part. The truth you've been avoiding all along." I frowned, confused. "I've faced the truth," I said. "I've seen my failures, my sins. I've forgiven others. I've forgiven myself." Lucifer smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, Margaret, you've scratched the surface, yes. But the truth, the real truth, that's something much deeper. And it's time you faced it." He gestured toward the chair, and the weight of it seemed to grow heavier. "Sit," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "This is the moment of decision." I hesitated, fear clawing at the edges of my mind. "Decision? About what?" "About everything," he said simply. "About who you are, who you want to be, and what you're willing to do to get there." The air seemed to thicken as I approached the chair, my legs trembling with every step. When I finally sat, the wood was cold against my skin, and the moment I settled, the room seemed to shift again. The walls stretched upward, disappearing into darkness, and the light overhead dimmed until only I was illuminated. A mirror appeared in front of me, large and ornate, its gilded frame glinting faintly in the dim light. But this wasn't like the mirrors I'd seen before. This one didn't show memories or fragments of the past. Instead, it showed me, or rather, it showed pieces of me. My reflection was fractured, split into dozens of shards, each one showing a different version of myself. In one shard, I was the proud, self-righteous woman I'd been for so much of my life, clutching a Bible to my chest like a shield. In another, I was younger, full of fire and ambition, determined to shape the world into my vision of what was right. In yet another, I was old and weary, weighed down by the regrets I'd refused to face until now. "You see, Margaret," Lucifer said, his voice soft but unrelenting, "you've always thought of yourself as one thing, a good Christian, a good woman. But the truth is, you're so much more and less than that. You're fractured, just like everyone else. And now, you must decide which piece of you will define you." "I don't understand," I said, my voice trembling. "How am I supposed to choose? They're all me." "Exactly," he said, stepping closer until he was standing just behind me. "Every piece is you. The sinner, the forgiver, the broken, the whole. But the question is, Margaret, which one will you embrace? Which one will you let go of?" The shards in the mirror began to shift, their edges shimmering like liquid. I could see the anger and judgment in some, the love and compassion in others. The more I looked, the more overwhelmed I felt. How could I possibly choose? How could I decide which part of me was worth keeping? "I don't know," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know how to do this." "You've already started," Lucifer said. "When you forgave Robert, when you helped Peter, when you faced yourself in the forest. Every step you've taken has been a choice. Now, you just have to finish what you started. I stared at the shards, my heart pounding in my chest. Each one seemed to pull at me, calling out with the weight of memories and emotions I couldn't ignore. But as I looked closer, I realized something. Not all the shards were equal. Some were smaller, dimmer, their edges jagged and broken. Others were larger, brighter, their surfaces smooth and inviting. I reached out hesitantly, my hand hovering over one of the brighter shards. It showed me helping Peter in the classroom, my hand on his shoulder as he finally began to smile. Another shard showed me forgiving Robert, the chains around him dissolving as the weight lifted from both of us. These, I said softly, my voice trembling but certain. These are the parts of me I want to keep. Lucifer nodded, his expression unreadable. And the others? I glanced at the darker shards, the ones that showed my anger, my judgment, my pride. They were pieces of me too, but as I looked at them now, I realized they no longer fit. They were heavy, toxic, and I didn't want to carry them anymore. I let them go, I said, my voice growing stronger. I let them go. As the words left my lips, the mirror began to glow, the shards melting into light. The brighter pieces coalesced, forming a new reflection, a reflection of me as I was now, whole, forgiven, free. The room shifted one final time, the walls dissolving into light. Lucifer stood before me, his expression oddly solemn. "You've made your choice," he said, "and now your journey is almost complete." I stood, the chair vanishing beneath me, and met his gaze. "What now?" I asked, my voice steady. "Now," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips, "you face the only one who can truly decide your fate. And this time, Margaret, you might just surprise him." The light around me grew brighter, pulling me upward, and for the first time since this journey began, I felt no fear. I was ready to face whatever came next. The light grew brighter, engulfing me completely until I could no longer see the room or even my own hands. It was warm, but not in a way that burned. It wrapped around me, soft and comforting, like stepping into the embrace of someone you'd thought was lost forever. For a moment, I forgot where I was, forgot about the trials I had faced, and let myself be held by that warmth. Then the light began to fade, and I found myself standing somewhere new. It was a field, vast and endless, with golden grass that swayed gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. The sky above was a deep, radiant blue, streaked with soft clouds that glowed with a light of their own. It was quiet here, not the silence of emptiness, but the kind of quiet that filled you with peace. I took a tentative step forward, and the ground beneath me felt solid, yet softer than any earth I had ever known. I knew I wasn't alone before I saw him. The presence was overwhelming, filling the air and my lungs, pressing against my soul with an intensity that was both humbling and uplifting. And then he was there, standing before me. I couldn't describe him if I tried. He wasn't a figure so much as an essence, a brightness, a feeling of love so pure and boundless that it brought me to my knees without a thought. I couldn't look at him directly, but I didn't need to. I could feel his gaze on me, seeing through every layer of my being as though I were made of glass. "Margaret," the voice said, not loud but resonating deep within me, filling every corner of my heart and mind. It was a voice I had heard before in whispers and moments of clarity, a voice that had been with me all along. I tried to speak, but no words came. My throat tightened, my chest heaving with the weight of everything I had carried here. The joy, the regret, the love, the pain, it all poured out of me in a flood of tears. I knelt there, unable to lift my head, afraid to face him, afraid of what he might say. "Do not fear," he said, and the words washed over me like water, cleansing and softening the hard edges of my heart. "You have come far." "I'm not worthy," I managed to whisper, my voice cracking. "I've failed so many times. I've hurt people. I've judged. I don't deserve to be here." There was a pause, not of hesitation, but of understanding, as though he were allowing me the space to spill every ounce of my shame. And yet you are here, he said. Not because you are perfect, but because you chose to see. You chose to love. You chose to let go. I shook my head, still overwhelmed. But I don't understand. Why me? Why would you give me another chance? Because I love you, he said simply, and the weight of those words broke something inside me. Not for what you have done or failed to do, but for who you are, for who you were made to be. The tears came harder then, and I felt his presence move closer, though he didn't touch me. He didn't need to. The love radiating from him was enough to fill every empty space inside me, every wound I'd hidden, every piece of myself I thought unworthy of redemption. Slowly, I found the courage to lift my head, to meet his gaze, or at least the sense of it. I've tried, I said, my voice trembling. I've tried to make things right, to let go of the things that held me back. But I don't know if it's enough. It is not about being enough, he said. It is about being willing. And you, Margaret, have shown that willingness. You have faced yourself. You have chosen love over pride, forgiveness over anger. And in doing so, you have drawn closer to me. The field around us seemed to shimmer, the golden grass glowing brighter as his words sank in. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what he was saying, not condemnation, but grace. Not judgment, but mercy. Is it over? Asked, my voice small. Have I done what I needed to do? He paused again, the silence filling me with anticipation rather than dread. There is one final choice, he said. One final act of faith. I frowned, unsure of what he meant. What choice? To trust, he said. To let go of the last piece of yourself that holds you back. To release your fear and step fully into the love I offer. I closed my eyes, the words echoing in my mind. Trust. It seemed like such a simple thing, but it was the hardest lesson I'd had to learn. Trust meant letting go of control, of certainty, of the walls I'd built to protect myself. It meant opening my hands and my heart, knowing there were no guarantees, only faith. Slowly, I stood, my legs trembling beneath me. I looked out over the field, at the endless horizon that seemed to stretch into eternity. I want to, I said, my voice steadying. I want to trust you. Then let go, he said, and you will find me waiting. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes again, lifting my face to the sky. I pictured everything I'd been holding on to, the pain, the fear, the doubt, and released it, imagining it floating away on the breeze. The warmth around me grew stronger, enveloping me completely until there was nothing else. No fear, no regret, only love. When I opened my eyes, the field was gone. I was standing in a hospital room, surrounded by the soft beeping of machines and the hushed murmurs of voices. My daughter, Susan, was there, her face pale and tear-streaked as she clutched my hand. Her husband stood beside her, his expression filled with a mix of hope and disbelief. Mom, Susan whispered, her voice trembling. Are you back? I squeezed her hand, my own trembling but steady. I'm here, I said, my voice soft but certain. I'm here. In that moment, I knew my journey wasn't over. I had been given a second chance, not just to live, but to live differently, to love more deeply, to forgive more freely, to trust more fully. And as I looked into my daughter's eyes, I felt the warmth of his presence still with me, a quiet reminder that I was never truly alone.